My name is Charlie Seay. I live in Cary, North Carolina. I was in World War II as an aviator, pilot of a B-25 bomber. I was in the South Pacific Theater in what was known as the 13th Air Force. Well, like many people in the World War II, I was a child of the Depression. My father was a fairly wealthy farmer who got caught in the boom in commodities in the early 20s. Most people don't realize this, but there was a depression in the farms before 1929. He invested heavily in pork. He had a farm, but he mortgaged the farm to buy pigs. Then the price of pigs dropped down so low, he always said you couldn't get for the pigs what it cost you to ship them somewhere. So he lost the farm. But the 1920s were good times up until the big depression in 1929. My father was able to get a job then in a factory, a DuPont rayon factory. Although I didn't really grow up on a farm, I'm kind of a farm boy because I came from a farm family. So my father got a job, but then the Depression finally hit in 1929. He lost his job, and we moved from Old Hickory, Tennessee, where we were living at the time, into Nashville, Tennessee. So I grew up in Nashville. I had to work at a grocery store, delivering groceries as a young man to make any kind of money at all. So eventually, when I was 17 and a half, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. But I was on my way to school, and my father, by this point, had a car, and we were driving to school on the Monday, and it was on the radio.
The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I was immediately inflamed, angry at the Japanese, and eager to do my part as a red-blooded American boy. So that led me to the early enlistment. And I asked my father if I could enlist in the Marines because they would take you at 17 and a half. But he wouldn't agree to sign for me to go in. He thought I should finish high school. So I did finish high school, but in the meanwhile, I went to check in the Air Corps recruiter and found out you could sign up to be an aviation cadet when you were only 17 and a half, and then when you were 18, long before you really have to sign up for the draft, you can be inducted and get into aviation cadet training. So I was what we called a burner. I had a burning desire to fly. So I was very fortunate that when I turned 18, I was able to make the trip to Camp Forest, Tennessee, and begin my training, which eventually took me to California. And I did most of my training in the California area, although I graduated from aviation cadets in Yuma, Arizona. I went to La Junta, Colorado then to begin training in B-25s. I didn't know whether I was going to be a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot, and I don't know how they determined it, maybe height, maybe some other characteristic. But I was assigned to be a bomber pilot. So I had my training there, went to Greenville, South Carolina, where I was trained by, believe it or not, by the pilots who had flown the Doolittle raid over Tokyo in the April of 1942.
Packed on the afterdeck of the Hornet are 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Never before have these huge planes been launched from a carrier. Doolittle pilots the lead plane. There's a breathless moment as the big bomber gathers speed. It's airborne. The first Army bomber ever to be launched from a carrier is safely in the air.
They were our trainers, and they taught us to take a B-25 off from an airport the way they did off of a carrier. Just put on the brakes, rev up the engines all the way, release the brakes, and pull it straight up in the air. So that was a skill that we learned very early, and we were very fortunate because a lot of the aerodromes on the little islands in the South Pacific that were too short for takeoff, so we had to pull it up in the air rather quickly. Well, the B-25 was one of the more successful planes in the war. There were successful fighters and there were successful heavy bombers, but the B-25 was in a class by itself among the medium bombers because it was very maneuverable, it was very reliable, it carried a nice heavy load, it was well set up to have protection from 50 caliber machine guns all around it. The B-25 was a twin-engine medium bomber. It had the same engine, a Curtiss Wright Cyclone engine, which also eventually powered the B-52, but it was called a 2500R. It was a radial engine, and it was horsepower was something over 450 horsepower, and it carried a bomb load. Then it had the power to carry a bomb load of well over 2,000 pounds. We normally carried we had room in the bomb bay for 20 bombs, 20 racks it was, but ordinarily you would, if you carried a bomb in each rack, you would only carry roughly 10 200-pound bombs, but you couldn't carry 100-pound bombs more than 20 either. But it had a good bomb load. It had a good range. You have a pilot and a co-pilot as lead on the B-25. The pilot usually is a young one. He flies missions until he's capable of taking over the command of the plane, which usually amounted to about 30 missions as a co-pilot, and then you can become a pilot. That's the way it worked out. But we had, in addition to pilot, co-pilot, we had an engineer, had a radio operator, we had a tail gunner, and we had a sky spy. He would substitute, he could be a bombardier, he could be a cannoneer. We eventually had a 75 millimeter cannon mounted on B-25, and it replaced a certain number of 50 caliber machine guns. The navigator, bombardier, observer, he was sometimes called, would have to load the shells into the cannon, and the pilot then would aim the plane at the target and push the trigger. It had two vertical stabilizers, rudders, they were called, which gave it a very smooth turning capacity. One of the things that made it maneuverable was the twin rudders. The other thing was the power of those engines and the fact that they responded very quickly to the throttle. When you would give it more gas, it responded very well, and you could handle it quite nicely. When you first get into a B-25, you're quite cramped. It's a pretty small cockpit for the size of the plane, but it's very noisy. The pilot is sitting right between the two engines and right in line with the propellers. So if you ever meet a former B-25 pilot, you can know that he's lost his hearing, as I have. I have hearing aids now, which I have from the VA. They don't ask any questions when they find you've been a B-25 pilot. They give you the hearing aids. We had in the 42nd Bomb Group, which was part of the 13th Air Force, we had 5 different squadrons. It was called the 13th Air Force because it was formed January 13th in 1943. I was in the 70th, and each squadron had about 25 planes. Most missions you flew in 4 echelons of 3 planes each ordinarily. Most missions consisted of 12 planes. So your ambition was to be lead plane. But if not, you could be an echelon. You could be the element leader. I was assigned to a plane that had the name Dark Eyes. All of the planes in the Air Corps had nose art on them. For some reason, every outfit has somebody that can paint, and they would paint pictures of beautiful girls on the side of the plane, like Heavenly Body. You can imagine what the girl was in that picture. And we had Dark Eyes, which had a similar girl, but it was the name of a song. I inherited that plane from the previous pilot when I got it.
I must follow still over plain and hill, love where'er I be, I shall always see stars of hope for me, your dark eyes.
My first mission was over Rabaul, which was the main target for a while, because it was the only thing that was blocking the Japanese, 13th Air Force and the Marines were the only things that were blocking the Japanese from moving out of Rabaul and down into New Guinea and then down into Australia. So it was a target for many planes, for many missions, but my first mission of any kind was over Rabaul.
October 1943. The enemy is making every effort to strengthen Rabaul. Reconnaissance reveals that some 20 vessels, including warships and large and small merchant ships, have recently entered the harbor. There are 294 airplanes on the strips of Rabaul. There are 60,000 troops. Rabaul is the most difficult target in the Southwest Pacific area.
And I'd heard these tales about how much anti-aircraft they had. They didn't have any fighter opposition. That's something that we didn't face in the 13th Air Force at the time that I was there. We had been so effective in bombing the aerodromes. Eventually, the Japanese planes couldn't take off because the aerodrome was torn up, and therefore their planes were just sitting there, and so their planes got knocked out. So I only had an attack on my plane by a fighter, Japanese fighter, one time, and as far as I could tell, they didn't hit any part of the plane. We looked for holes, but we didn't shoot it down. We shot at it, but we weren't able to shoot it down. The only real opposition we had from the Japanese was in anti-aircraft. And they would have such heavy anti-aircraft, it would be like flying into a field of bursts, would be like flying into a black cloud. But when you were on a mission, you had to fly straight and level and hold the plane just so the bombardier could use his Norden bomb sight. And it has to be straight and level so he can drop it. So we were fairly accurate with our bombing, which resulted in their loss of planes. But it also was very effective in ground strafing with all the machine guns we had. At one point there, I was flying out of a field, and I saw a Japanese plane in the air in a little bit of a distance. flying in the opposite direction of the way I was going. Well, I turned, and I was going to use my plane like a fighter plane. I had enough firepower. If I could have gotten in position behind him, I probably would have been able to shoot him down. But the plane, I guess, saw me coming and got into a deep cloud bank, and I didn't have radar to follow him, so I lost him in the clouds. When the lead plane opens theirs, you open yours, and so that doesn't change anything. But then when he drops and you drop, the plane does a little bounce. But then the lead plane immediately makes a turn, one way or the other, up or down. You don't want to stay on that flight path any longer than necessary. So sometimes you had to make a very, very steep turn to stay inside the turn of the lead plane. So that part was the only scary part. Sometimes you feel like you're going to go upside down. Probably would have managed it. I think the B-25 was strong enough that it would have managed, but it's much better to fly straight and level. We were supposed to fly 50 missions, and I hit the 50, but we couldn't get replacements, so I just kept on flying. So eventually I flew 70 missions. I was in the 70th Squadron, and it got to be a superstition. You don't want to fly a 70th because that's when you're going to get hit. That's one too many. Well, nobody really believed it, except I remember one pilot that called in sick on the day he was supposed to fly his 70th mission because he was scared to fly it on that particular one. But it turned out to be a very uneventful mission. I went on it as I should have, and we were on a boat sweep. We were looking for Japanese ships in the harbors, and we found one. It was a 3-masted sailing ship, a schooner, painted white, but it was sort of hidden in the trees in this harbor. And we flew over it very low, sort of skip bombing. We dropped one bomb on one side of it and one right on the other, and it just blew the whole thing right up in the air. It split apart. It was a terrible waste of a beautiful ship, but it was exciting to us to see that at least that one enemy ship was taken out of commission. Any time that I fail to mention that I said my silent prayers, I apologize, because I always did. I always prayed that, but I'm sure everybody else did, and I had faith that things were going to work out. I never believed that I wouldn't get hit or wouldn't have to crash, but I can't visualize me not surviving. But if I did, I'm in the hands of the Lord. I think religion was very important to me, but I think it was very important to a lot of people too. Anything that kept you calm was a good thing, but that was a life-saving thing. Even in my training days, I used to feel pride of watching the flag as we marched. We would have a flag on the flagpole up above us all. Even in the States while we were training, I always felt like that I was serving the flag. The flag was always important to me, and I would like to have been there to see the raising the flag on Iwo Jima. I'm sure that must have been a thrilling thing to live through. But we didn't talk very much about patriotism, but we didn't talk about unpleasant things either. But what I remember is striving to live calm and assume everything is going to turn out all right, and not take anything too seriously. my faith allowed me to do that. But the patriotism, you were always conscious that you were defending America. You were fighting somebody, and I'm sure it'd been the same if we'd been in Europe and fighting the Germans. It would have been the same sense. That's the enemy of America, and my personal involvement would strengthen me. I don't think that I had anything special. I think it was normal. Sometimes anybody I see my age, I always ask them, did you serve in the war? And if they did, I tell them, thank you for your service. I feel grateful for what the present generation is doing and all in between.